faked before and after photos, manipulated clinical studies, idiot dermatologists endorsing scientifically baseless products. This is just a fraction of what you are up against when shopping for hair loss solutions online. And in this video, we will show you exactly how these people lie to you and what you can do to protect yourself. Another hair loss company was just caught faking their before and after photos and customer testimonials. This is a growing problem in the hair loss industry, but really for all direct-to-consumer brands out there. And in this video, I'm going to reveal a bunch of examples about how marketing deceit and violations in truth in advertising are actually hindering consumers' access to making good treatment choices for their hair loss. We're also going to talk about 3 principles that you can employ starting today to put yourself in a position where you can do away with all the noise online and actually focus on what works. If you're watching this video and you're watching it for the sole purpose of just being told what to do, this is not the video for you. This is more of the teach a person how to fish approach. I don't want to necessarily just tell you what to do. That's going to vary depending on your age, your gender, your hair loss types, your comfortabilities with certain treatments, your financial situations. No, this is about teaching you the principles that are going to guide you through all of those decisions in the most effective and efficient way possible. So if you're wondering who I am, my name is Rob English. I am a consumer advocate. I'm also a researcher who specializes in hair loss disorders. And for the last 10 years, I've run the website perfecthairhealth.com. Perfect Hair Health is basically a center for education and consumer advocacy for all things hair. We have a small team of researchers, we publish papers, and we also provide personal services to individuals who are fighting hair loss, feeling overwhelmed, and just wanting the access to good information and a path forward that makes sense for them. Check out our free content there. We have hundreds of articles. We have 5 peer-reviewed papers. We have a ton more free interactive guides and resources that should really make a difference for you. And it's all accessible right now. Now, let's get back to the topic of this video, how marketing sleight of hand, how deceitful marketing tactics, how truth in advertising violations are basically hindering your ability to make good decisions in the hair loss industry. Well, the first thing that you have to think about here is why the hair loss industry exists in the first place. I mean, obviously people are losing their hair, so you want to have an industry that solves that problem. But this industry doesn't exist to grow your hair. Growing your hair is often a distant afterthought. Instead, this industry exists to make money, to sell you things first. Very few interventions actually regrow hair, but hundreds of things give you the impression that they'll regrow hair. And in this video, we want to talk about why that's the case and how to avoid what looks good, the shiny objects that you see on your Instagram feed, versus what actually is good, the things that are going to work for you starting today. So let's open up with a little bit of a story about my time working with a research group. A couple of years ago, I was working with a research contractor who had done a lot of other contracts for other companies. They were a PhD in the fields that we look for when writing research papers. And effectively, this individual was kind of lamenting about other clients that they had to us. They mentioned this comment about how they were working for this hair loss company. And this hair loss company, they wanted to make a claim on their label about their supplement that they were selling. They wanted to make the claim that it regrows hair. And that claim has to be proven out in a randomized, double-blinded, placebo-controlled clinical study. But they didn't have that study. They just wanted to make the claim. And the marketing team in that claim made the decision, with the CEO's approval, to illegally put that on the bottle. And the rationale was that they knew that if they put that on the bottle, the boost in sales that they would experience would be far beyond the fine they would receive once the FDA or anybody else uncovered that they were making a claim that was considerably false. So they could get away with lying for a long enough window to offset the fine they would get from selling a product that didn't do the thing that it claims. That is the level of morality and ethics in the hair loss industry. That's basically what you're up against here. And so I open with that story to kind of tell you why you can't really trust anything online. And this is really the first principle that I want to discuss with you. It's the idea that you need to be skeptical about everything. Let's talk about a few domains where you really do need to be skeptical. I'll also give you some examples of effectively tons and tons of companies that you've probably heard of that have broken this trust for you. So let's talk about why you need to be skeptical of something called before and after photos online. This is a trust building tool. You go to a website, a company, a supplement company, a topical, you name it. You want to know if the product works. How do you know if the product works? Look at customer reviews, look at before and after photos and say, hey, did that person regrow hair? And you go to these websites and you'll see tons and tons of photos of customers who regrew a ton of hair allegedly from the product. Now, let's talk about some recent examples where companies that appeared to be incredibly impressive in terms of hair regrowth actually just were faking their before and after photos. One of the most recent examples of this was a company called Cosma RNA. Now, Cosma RNA had been pioneering a new technology that was targeting the androgen receptors for individuals who are suffering from androgenic alopecia, or male and female pattern hair loss. And this is one of the most common hair loss disorders in the world. It's driven by genetics and male hormones, and it's chronic and progressive. So without treatment, it generally will tend to worsen. Now, I mention this because it's also one of the biggest cash cows for hair loss companies. The condition progresses so slowly that it often takes 6 months, 12 months to notice any cosmetic differences in hair growth. And so you can have somebody buy something for a 6 to 12 month period, and there can be ambiguous results, and all the while they can be thinking, well, maybe it's working. So when you see before and after photos that discern a true improvement online, you think, wow, this is amazing. I want to buy that product. Well, Cosma RNA knew this. They knew that social validation in the form of photos was really important. So what ended up happening? Well, they had a team, a marketing team, and they took photos of somebody's scalp, and then they photoshopped those photos. They added in a bunch of hair where it didn't exist. And then they advertised those online as results from their product. Eventually, people figured it out. They noticed that the photos appeared photoshopped. The improvements from the actual models were so impressive that they would rival that of the best FDA-approved drugs for one of the top responders as well. And they were caught. And it broke the trust of the people in the community. And it also, unfortunately, really hurt the reputation of Cosma RNA. Once you fake a before and after photo, there's no unfaking it. That's a stain on your resume forever that you can't unscrub. So they're not the only company doing that kind of stuff. There's tons out there. Another example would be photoshopping or even stealing images from other people. So earlier this year, there was a company, Effluvium, and they were blowing up on everybody's social news feed for their new hair growth product. And you would go and you would visit what would oftentimes just look like a simple ClickFunnels sales page from the mid to late 2000s, but it had these incredible before and after photos. And some people were noticing that some of the before and after photos weren't just photos, they were videos. They were videos of people from Instagram showing the results of their products. Well, lo and behold, those videos weren't actually of people using their products. Effluvium was actually stealing influencers' photo and video transformations, and they were doing it from people who weren't even using their products. And they knew that there would be a delta between the time that those people figured it out and the time where they could capture email leads, new customers, etc., into their sales flow to just keep driving up and up and up their sales volume. So they did this with a number of influencers, and eventually it was discovered and they were called out for it. And then those ads eventually went away, but not before they made a ton of money in the meantime. So stealing images is another one. That's not the only thing that ends up happening. Sometimes you have a combination of both stealing images and those images happen to be Photoshop, which I find to be absolutely hysterical. Recently, there was a company out of San Francisco. I'm not going to name them, but they were a hair loss startup company for personalized treatments. And we signed up to be a part of their email list. And we noticed that in one of their emails for their before and after feature, there was an individual who looked like they regrew a ton of hair. But when you looked a little bit closer at the photo, it looked like somebody literally just drew black paint over the temple region of their hairline. I mean, we're talking about like a very low quality, low grade, faked before and after photo that would be incredibly obvious. In fact, the angulation and the tone and the photo and everything perfectly matched in the after photo as the before photo, which is basically impossible. But they perfectly matched each other, and there's no way to actually do that in real life. There's going to be some subtle differences here and there. So the photo was clearly faked. And we looked at this photo and we thought it was hilarious because they actually might have taken this photo from another company called Nordic Biolabs that was using that same photo set to sell their supplement, their topical that had no clinical support behind it beyond the social validation that they were manufacturing. But then what was even better about this was that that company wasn't even the first person to use that before and after photo. If you do a reverse image search on that before and after photo, there's a bunch of Amazon resellers using that same exact image. There's a bunch of YouTubers using it to tell you how to regrow hair. I mean, the list of people using this before and after photo set is in the dozens and dozens and dozens to sell their individual product. I mean, was that one person there just trying all of those products? No. What ended up happening was that companies saw an opportunity to deceive you by faking a before and after photo. It just so happens that they were lazy enough not to actually invent a new before and after photo. So that's just one of the many that are copied out there. So before and after photos, from the Photoshop perspective, from the stealing perspective, both from influencers and from other companies, and even hair transplant surgeons, a lot of those are stolen as well. That really obfuscates the landscape here. And unless you're running reverse image searches and Photoshop analyses on every single photo out there, you're probably not going to know what's legitimate and what isn't. So what are the other ways that you can fake before and after photos? Well, they can actually happen accidentally. So let me explain to you what I mean. Earlier, I talked about how there's androgenic alopecia, or male and female hair loss. And pattern hair loss, as it's also called, progresses very slowly over a number of years to decades. But you can have pattern hair loss, and then you can also have other kinds of hair loss that coincide with pattern hair loss. One of them is called telogen effluvium shedding. Now, telogen effluvium shedding is triggered very suddenly, and it's often a temporary form of hair loss that self-resolves. So say that you go through bereavement or a divorce, or you have a brutal flu that you experience with a high fever for weeks on end, or you go through child rearing. All of these types of things can cause 2 to 4 months later a shed that's known as a telogen effluvium shed. And it's where you dump a bunch of hair, and then with enough time away from the stressor and no interventions aside from just waiting, eventually that hair recycles and comes back, and over a 3 to 8 month period, your hair's looking a lot thicker. And then over a 1 to 2 year period, it's as if you never had that hair loss disorder in the first place. So let me give you an example of a real before and after photo that people use that shouldn't be applied to a treatment. So the scenario is that somebody has no pattern hair loss, or they have a telogen effluvium shed due to a really bad flu that they got. And they go through all of this hair loss, and they don't consult a doctor to understand what's causing it, but they know they want to do something about it. So that customer goes and they buy a product online, a supplement, a topical, a program, you name it. Now, that individual starts to take that product over and over and over again. And about 2, 4, 5 months later, they start to see regrowth. And 1 year later, they got incredible results. That individual equates and conflates the results of their regrowth with the product they were using, when in reality, it was always just the telogen effluvium shed recovery that caused the regrowth. And if they had not been using that product, the only thing that they needed to do was just give themselves time. That example of a telogen effluvium shed being conflated as an androgenic alopecia treatment happens over and over and over again online. And unless you know what the presentation looks like, unless you know the history of the individual who is featuring that before and after photo, the customer themselves, you can never tease out this possibility. So some people are submitting before and after photos for their products, and those individuals, they truly believe that the product works. They truly believe that. And the company also wants to believe it, but they're conflating the recovery of a hair loss type that has nothing to do with their product with the efficacy of their product. And that's just a huge problem overall. Okay, so we've talked about photoshopped images, stolen images. We've talked about telogen effluvium sheds. Let's talk about real regrowth from poorly supported treatments. Now, how do we think about regrowth? Well, let's look at the way that clinical studies defined hair count improvements. Generally speaking, a well-designed clinical study will measure somebody's hair counts at a microscopic level at the beginning of their study. And then they'll measure them 3, 6, 9, 12 months, et cetera, into the future. And some of those people, if the product is working, will see an improvement. And the average result of all individuals inside of that study in terms of hair count changes, that will make a trend line. And if the trend line goes up, then that trend line suggests that on average, somebody will experience a positive hair growth effect from that treatment. Sounds simple enough. Now, here's the thing that you need to remember. The trend line represents what's probable. It's the average response across everybody in that study. An individual data point represents what's possible. And what's possible does not represent the average. It represents one single person's experience using that product. So if you have a customer who tries a product and it works incredibly well for them, they might only be 1 out of 1,000 people. They might have a 1 in 1,000 response to that product. But if you sell your product to 30,000 people, 50,000 people, and you collect 100 of those 1 in 1,000 photos or 1 in 500 responses, now you post all of those on your website, and people then level set. They create a new baseline. That expectation now becomes their expectation because they see all these photos and they think to themselves, oh yeah, well, obviously I'm going to get those results because look at all these people who got those results. And yet they don't tell you that those are the top, best of the best responders. Now, the people who say that certain natural interventions don't work or certain poorly supported interventions don't work, I think that that argument kind of misses this nuance. They certainly work for some people. Conventional treatments certainly work for some people. They also certainly don't work for some people. The point is that if we're only ever benchmarking on the best of the best of the best responders, then we create a false impression of what an average hair loss treatment on both the natural side and the conventional side can do. And we've seen this problem develop on a lot of different websites. You can look at photos of people doing PRP or PRP plus A-cell, and you will see these amazing outcomes. And as long as they're not, just disclosing that they got PRP, but they were also using finasteride, which happens way too frequently, effectively we can say they did see that response, but it's the 1 in 1,000 response. And what matters to you as a consumer, as a customer of PRP, is not the 1 in 1,000 response. That's an unlikely event for you. What matters to you is the trend line. What's the average response? And what's the standard deviation of responses? You want a tightly wound response rate across a trend line. You want the standard deviations to be small so your expectations for that trend can be high. But in poorly supported interventions, the standard deviations for regrowth are massive. Tons of people see no growth at all. One or two people will see massive regrowth. And you need to know this when you're looking at these before and after photos. So we're looking at stolen images, faked before and after photos. We're looking at companies that will say, hey, look, this product worked wonders for my client, but they didn't disclose that that client was also using minoxidil, finasteride, dutasteride. We have Telogen effluvium shedding events, and then we have the 1 in 1,000 response rate, the true responders to these interventions that, as their lived experience demonstrates, the intervention worked amazingly for them. But that's probably not going to be your experience. You want to benchmark to the average. So you can't really trust before and after photos, which means what can you trust? Well, the next rung that people trust are dermatology endorsements. They say, well, I'm not going to be an adept enough consumer to tell you with absolute certainty that this product is going to be effective. So I'm going to turn to the experts, and the experts are going to tell me, this product will work. And so they turn to doctors and dermatologists who endorse products. And that endorsement builds another degree of trust. And so they say, well, okay, if I can trust the doctor and the dermatologist, then I'll trust the product itself and then I'll buy it and let's see if it works. Let me tell you something about dermatologists. Most of them, when they get out of school, residency, and they finish becoming dermatologists, they don't do anything other than follow the money. They go into Mohs surgery, they open their medical spas, they become cosmetic dermatologists who just inject Botox and fillers all day. I don't mean to be so critical and frustrated with dermatologists, but I've hit a point now in my journey on this as a consumer advocate where I've seen firsthand and experienced firsthand the lacking care and empathy of dermatologists in this specific disorder, that effectively I'm under the impression now that there is no other condition for which the specialists who are supposed to be treating it are more inadequate, are more inept. The average patient experience when you go into a dermatologist seeking advice for hair loss is something along the lines of this. They'll go in, and if you're a woman, you'll talk about how you're, shedding a ton of hair. The dermatologist will generally try to convince you that your hair looks fine, that you're probably crazy, and that, for one reason or another, you don't really need to worry about this. Like, it's not too noticeable to her or him, so, you shouldn't care because they don't care about it. And then they'll try to upsell you into things like PRP, A cells, stem cells, exosomes. And if you're a man, they'll do some similar song and dance, but the key thing here is that they won't do any type of analysis of your scalp. They won't take a dermatoscope, they won't take a phototrichogram device, they won't hold a magnifier up to your scalp and look for markers that might differentiate the hair loss type that they suspect you have, if any at all, from other things. They won't examine to see if you have any scalp inflammation whatsoever. They won't do a detailed analysis of your health history. And so I have a lot of problems with dermatologists. I think that in 2025, if a dermatologist sees a patient that is complaining of hair loss and they don't hold a microscopic device for 3 minutes of time against their scalp skin to measure hair diameter diversity, look for the presence of empty hair follicles, look for white scales associated with seborrheic dermatitis, look for black dots associated with immune-related hair loss disorders or maybe trichotillomania. If they don't do these things at a fundamental level, they are a moron. They are just an idiot. And you really should treat them as a moron and an idiot and walk out of that appointment and get your money back. That is my opinion at this point. I don't think that these people deserve any lip service of benefit anymore, and I'm pretty fundamentally disappointed with the way that dermatologists, on average, are treating their hair loss patients. So when you think about this, let's liken the typical standard dermatological treatment for somebody dealing with hair loss, which is no microscopic analysis and a very limited health history review and very generic advice that often roots in their cash cow benefits from selling PRP, stem cells, exosomes, you name it. Let's liken that to cancer treatments. What if you had a lump and rather than do a biopsy or some sort of imaging study on that lump, the doctor just looked at it and said, "You're fine, try stem cells." That doctor would be sued and they'd probably lose their medical license. So why is it okay for a dermatologist to do that and not okay for an oncologist to do that? I get that the difference can be life and death with cancer, but hair loss is incredibly psychologically damaging to people. And I really don't think that anybody is getting a service done when you go into the dermatologist and that's your level of treatment. They have to do better. Now, I mention this because when you think of the lacking moral compasses and lacking ethics for most hair loss companies, and then you look at just the follow the money approach of most cosmetic dermatologists, when one of these hair loss companies gets a hold of 1,000 emails for dermatologists and they send an email blast out saying that they're going to give $10,000, $15,000 to anybody who endorses their product, do you think 50 or 100 cosmetic dermatologists who are complete morons are going to bite? The answer is yes. They're 100% going to bite on that. And they're going to then promote the product and say things like, "I love the evidence." And yet the evidence is often complete trash on the products that they are promoting. Now, I don't mean to trash all dermatologists. There are some incredible dermatologists who specialize in hair loss disorders. Ralph Trueb, Ralph Paus, Jeffrey Donovan. And all of these individuals have 1 year to 18-month long wait lists. And I bet you when they get those same emails blasted to them, they do the thing that they should be doing, which is move them to spam. So These types of people, you're not going to see them endorsing specific hair growth products. You might see them leading clinical studies on certain interventional approaches that are experimental in nature and then talking about that. But you're not going to see them promoting a brand. And the reason why is because they're actual hair loss researchers. They actually want to help you, and they care to such a high degree about their patient population that they would never tarnish their reputation with some dumb endorsement. So I say these things in the sense of, you need to be skeptical of dermatological endorsements. And one of the biggest endorsed products by dermatologists on the planet is a product called Nutrafol. So let's move on to the third node here of what you can't trust, the clinical studies from most hair loss companies. And that'll also bring us to Nutrafol and why I think that the 300 plus dermatological endorsements that they've gotten are just basically a litmus test to demonstrate idiocracy amongst those dermatologists. Now, Nutrafol is a supplement that is sold predominantly to women for hair growth. And they push in their marketing pretty regularly that their supplement is one of the best studied on the planet for hair growth. And they have published peer-reviewed studies, and these peer-reviewed studies are prospective, randomized, often double or triple blinded, and placebo-controlled. So they're really well done, and they create all these incredible talking points for these dermatologists. So where am I going with this? What would be wrong with this product? Well, if you do the hard work of going to the clinicaltrial.gov database and looking into Nutrafol's study design, and specifically their inclusion and exclusion criteria, remember that their customers are people dealing with hair loss. So they have a diagnosable hair loss disorder. If you look at their exclusion criteria, the studies that they designed didn't include anybody with a diagnosable hair loss disorder. Imagine enrolling patients for a cancer treatment, but in your study, you have no cancer patients. What kind of conclusions can you draw from a study to treat cancer that has nothing to do with patients who have cancer? This is the same with hair loss. And what's so fascinating about Nutrafol is that they repeated this design not once, which is potentially forgivable, but twice. In fact, they had a third clinical study that was done in female pattern hair loss sufferers, somebody who had, basically people who had a diagnosable hair loss disorder. And lo and behold, that study never got published. So I wonder why. It's something that I think about probably once a month. Now, I could maybe guess, and my guess would be that the results probably weren't that great. And so they've done these other obfuscated study designs that really don't include people with a diagnosable hair loss disorder, because they know that that study design repeated can get repeated results. And that's not the only company who's done that. Viviscal has used the same exact medical group that Nutrafol has used to do the same exact study and get, once again, a favorable result. If there is anything that I have learned in the world of marketing, hair, direct-to-consumer research, direct-to-consumer marketing, whatever you want to call it, it's that the best product usually doesn't win. It's the best marketed product. And if you want a perfect example of this, look no further than athletic greens. If you want to look into athletic greens, check it out. You can look at the research supporting that and the marketing pushes behind it. I find that product to be so poorly supported, but it's so incredibly popular because the coolest people on the planet are endorsing it. And I think that's a shame. And it's not their responsibility as non-experts to make these discernments of what works and what doesn't. That's not their responsibility, but it is the expert's responsibility. And so if somebody who's a nutritionist or somebody else who's endorsing athletic greens has some sort of background that would basically determine that they could make a good judgment on that product and they're still endorsing it, that deserves to be judged to a certain extent. So that closes out why you can't trust what you see on the internet. You can't trust what you see, what you hear, what you read. By the way, I'm not telling you to trust me either. You could certainly make an argument that because I have a website that's a consumer advocacy website and I sell personal services related to hair loss, so I have a lot of one-on-one calls that are paid with people, that maybe I'm just here to confuse you. And maybe I'm just here to, make you feel so uncertain that you have to buy a consult with me. And if that's your takeaway from this video, I'm fine with that. That's certainly not my impression of our work or the body of research that we've put together. But if you decide to walk away from this with that impression, I hold no problems with that. I am here to show you the roadmap. The purpose of this video is to show you the roadmap on things you need to be thinking about regardless of who you're listening to. So this applies not just to me, it applies to everybody. That's principle number 1. Don't trust what you see on the internet. Principle number 2, you have to know yourself better than marketers know you. If you are going to effectively navigate the landmines that exist in this space, you have to know yourself better than marketers know you. So what do I mean by that? Well, we do a lot of internal surveys on members of our website and on our email list. And one of the things that people sign up for our email list to learn about is sometimes natural treatments for hair growth. And one of the questions that we like to ask them is, well, why do you want to take a natural approach to hair regrowth? And you can learn a lot about somebody based on their answers. And you can learn a lot about how marketers probably know them better than themselves based on their answers. So I'll give you a couple of answers to that question that we commonly get. One of the answers is that they've actually tried drugs before and they got side effects. In that respect, that's very understandable. If I am trying a frontline therapeutic for hair loss and I think that everything's going to be okay, and then I try it and I get the side effect, I have to withdraw from the medication, well, of course I'm going to try a natural intervention after that. The only thing that I think these individuals should have known or could know if they were better educated would be that effectively you can titrate down your dose, reduce your risk of side effects. You can change your formulation, reduce your risk of side effects. There's some topical medications that you can use that have very low percutaneous absorption. And in addition to that, you can also use topical doses and use blood tests of hormones like DHT to approximate systemic leakage to certain topicals so that you can actually almost completely localize the effects of things like topical finasteride or topical dutasteride to the scalp. And you can get that N=1 data. So if you got side effects when you first started these pharmaceuticals, did you go through those roadmaps? And it's not on them to know this, but if this is what's driving them toward natural treatments, then of course that's understandable. The next thing that we hear a lot for why somebody has a preference toward natural treatments is that, it's just within their worldviews. Their worldview is that they prefer natural treatments over conventional treatments. And I personally don't think there's a lot to argue with here. If that's somebody's leading principle, then I get it. I will say that technically caffeine is a pharmaceutical. And so the people who have these world preferences over just natural treatments, they oftentimes drink coffee that contains caffeine. And so there's a lot of things here that, can be potentially hypocritical. However, I don't necessarily see that as too hypocritical because you can also make the argument that, pharmaceutical companies create, in many cases, compounds that don't exist within nature, and they can be foreign to the body and they're not regularly exposed to. And in that respect, I totally understand where they're coming from. I don't want to make an apples to oranges comparison. I'm also fully aware that the same company that created finasteride, Merck, is also the same company that created the drug Vioxx, which was pushed through clinical research and FDA approval based on fraudulent data that later ended up leading to the deaths of 50,000 people. So yeah, pharmaceuticals, plenty to criticize there, plenty of billions of dollars of fines issued out to tons and tons of people. To tons and tons of pharmaceuticals because of data obfuscation and all these other problems. So I get it if it's a worldview thing, as long as you're aware that natural companies also cheat their clinical trials and that this is just a function of capitalism that is poorly regulated, then of course, fair game. The next thing that we hear though, is that often that drugs are not safe. And we've double clicked into this with some of our members with an additional survey. And what we've asked them is, what is your current treatment protocol then? Or what's your current health protocol? And a lot, and I mean a lot of people have said, well, I'm not taking finasteride because I saw a study that showed that it increased my risk of prostate cancer. But I am taking a multivitamin. And that multivitamin includes vitamin E and selenium. And we find this to be a little bit ironic and disappointing. And the reason why is because Vitamin E and selenium increase the risk of prostate cancer in men who already have replete levels of vitamin E and selenium, which is basically most people in the developed world, or the places where people have enough money to supplement with vitamin E and selenium. And in fact, if you look into the studies on finasteride, there was an 18 to 21 year study that teased out the effects of 5 milligrams of oral finasteride daily on the risks of prostate cancer. And an early signal from that study was that, yes, potentially there was a directional increased risk of certain types of prostate cancer in that study. But throughout the 18 to 21 year period, as more data was collected out of tens of thousands of participants, the end result of that study was that the early findings were overridden. In fact, finasteride had a directional 25% reduced risk of prostate cancer overall and no impact on all-cause mortality. And this is important because 1 in 8 men die with prostate cancer, 1 in 11, something like that. It's a pretty high number. And it's usually not a type of cancer that ends up, really killing somebody, and it's well managed. And so that complete data set really tells a different story, and yet that complete data set, that same consumer is not aware of the follow-up studies that showed that information. They're only aware of the early reports, because that early report was the only thing that got featured in the news media that wanted to sensationalize about concerns over finasteride. And the irony here is that this individual has no idea that there was a 35,000 person study that actually demonstrated that selenium and vitamin E were driving up prostate cancer risks. And that study was actually halted because the effects were so large, 100%, 110% increases in the treatment groups, that they had to stop the study due to ethics. So you look at this and you think to yourself, what's going on here? What's forming these bases for decision making? And it's something known as asymmetrical information, meaning that you didn't have the full story over the interventions you were interested in and the interventions that you were not interested in. And as a result of that, you made a decision based on partial information that is now unfortunately hurting your outcomes, both in terms of adverse events and then also probably in terms of efficacy. Now, I mention these things because there is a level of cognitive dissonance in the person who avoids finasteride because of their concerns with side effects, and yet has no qualms or concerns or problems taking a completely unproven, untested, unstudied extract from a rare plant in Indonesia, concentrated at 50,000 times its normal levels of exposure that you would get if you ate all the berries, and then 55 other ingredients that are poorly studied from a manufacturer outside of the US that is wrought with heavy metal contamination in every single pill that you swallow. I think there is great irony here that people avoid hair loss drugs and in many cases opt for supplements, some of which have been found to be harmful, like in the case of vitamin E and selenium, and others in the case of antioxidants where all-cause mortality isn't seen to be improved by antioxidants like, vitamin E, beta-carotene, vitamin C. In fact, if anything, there's a 5% increased risk of all-cause mortality when you take those long-term. So there is some irony here, but the core of this is not your fault. It's not your fault that you don't know these things. You don't live and breathe this research. The problem is that you just don't have the information. You're not given the information. It's because marketers fearmonger over the side effects of drugs to get you to sell into their supplements and topicals that are allegedly devoid of those side effects, according to them. That's usually not the case. They're just painting a skewed picture of reality. And likewise, pharmaceutical companies will talk about what works, and oftentimes their products do work to a high extent, and they'll downplay side effects as well. And of course, there's their track record of getting fined billions of dollars for killing people, which is a problem, and kind of another stain on the resume that's really hard to scrub off. So if you're not aware of the full story, you can't really make perfect decisions. And that is another thing that marketers know about you. So they manipulate you in that respect. You have to know yourself better than the marketers know you. And sometimes that means educating yourself. Another thing that you have to know about yourself is really how fast you're losing hair. So on average, the average hair loss sufferer loses hair at 5% hair volume per year. But that is an average on a bell curve. Some people lose hair at 1%, some people lose hair at 30%. And depending on where you fall on that bell curve, you might have a ton of time to experiment with interventions that are poorly supported, and you might have no time at all, because it is a lot easier to stop hair loss than it is to regrow hair from a year ago, 2 years ago. So let me give you an example. Say that you're losing hair at 1%, you try a treatment that is poorly supported, it doesn't work, so 12 months from now you're down 1% in hair volume, no big deal. Say if you're losing hair at 25% per year, and you try that same treatment, and now your hair loss is cosmetically worse after 12 months, and you're probably not going to get that hair back. That is a problem. You need to understand how fast you're losing hair, and that should determine how much wiggle room you give yourself for playing around with interventions that have poor support. So you really need to know that. And you also need to know if your decisions and behaviors and preferences are at all rooted in cognitive dissonance or asymmetrical information exposure. And then the third principle here is that you have to know the evidence. Now, it's not your job as a consumer to know the evidence. It's exhausting reading through hair loss studies. I've read through thousands of them. But there are some really easy principles and really easy frameworks that you can apply to know good ingredients, good treatments, good products from the bad. There's basically 3 pieces of evidence that you need to consider. And these 3 pieces of evidence constitute the treatment metrics that we've developed over a series of years at our site, where our PhDs, our researchers go in and grade individual products. So the first key metric is evidence quality. Basically, it just asks the question, what's the evidence supporting or not supporting any ingredient or therapy for hair growth? Is the evidence in petri dishes? Is it in animal models? Is there good human data? Is there good human data in androgenic alopecia sufferers? And then what's the quality of that data, the conflicts of interest, the risk of bias for that data, the sample sizes, all that stuff. And that gives you a score out of 100 on our site. You can check out all of these treatment metrics, by the way, just by visiting our site. I'll link them below. The second key metric is regrowth potential. So how much hair growth can you expect on average from this product? This is a 0 to 4 point scale on our site. A 0 to 1 is microscopic hair gains. So you can see it in a microscope, but you cannot see that hair regrowth in person. You have to break above a 1 to see cosmetic regrowth, according to those trend lines on average that you can see and feel. Now remember, earlier I mentioned this. Trend lines are not individual data points. They're the aggregate of those points. So what's possible is not what's probable. Keep that in mind as you're navigating your treatments. You will see hyper-responders to everything out there, but what matters is the trend line, because that's your most likely response. And that's what our regrowth metrics actually show on our site. And we use clinical data to capture these things. And then the last thing is long-term viability. So is this treatment expensive? Is it accessible? Is it easy to administer? Is there long-term safety data on it? Those questions must be asked, because say that a treatment is super safe, but it costs $50,000, it's probably not that accessible to anybody either. They have to go into a clinic to see it. That treatment's not viable for the average hair loss sufferer. But if the treatment is inexpensive, it only takes 1 minute a day to apply or to take as a pill, and it's really, really accessible, and there's long-term safety data on it, then that treatment is something that you can adhere to long-term. We have a lot of people on our site that experiment with things like microneedling scalp massages, PRP, Botox injections, and all these things, for one reason or another, have low long-term adherence because they're arduous to do, or not arduous, but difficult to adhere to on a long-term basis, or they're expensive, and so people fall off. And these things have to be considered when you're experimenting with hair loss treatments and when you're selecting ones at the outset. So you can check out our treatment metrics for more information. So those are the 3 principles that I think if you follow as somebody facing hair loss will help you navigate the landmines that exist in this industry right now. I think that with these 3 principles, you can avoid a lot of lost time, money, and hair. You can put yourself in an incredible position for success. And while this video is not going to exactly tell you exactly what to do for you, it is here for a bigger purpose. It's here to talk to you about the next time that you see that ad on Instagram, why you shouldn't believe it. Next time that you see that post on Reddit about some major regrowth from some new supplement, why you should be skeptical. And the next time that some idiot dermatologist endorses some sort of product that isn't even studied on people who actually have a diagnosable hair loss disorder, you can laugh at that dermatologist in their own embarrassment and shame. Okay, that is everything. By the way, please let me know if you like these types of videos. We work really hard to make our videos high quality and scripted, and we work with an editor, and I have researchers who help me put together all of the science behind things, and it is like a big production. And inside of our membership, I just talk a lot in videos like this over Loom to members and in live calls and in groups, and I actually really enjoy it. And if you enjoy this too, if you find value out of this, I can produce a lot more videos of this nature, and it could be fun for me, but I'm only going to do it if you also get value out of it. So I'm trying something new here, and it's not necessarily the highest production value video that we have out here, but it is an uncut, unedited, basically unscripted version of things that I wanted to say for a while. Call it a rant, if you will. Okay, that's everything. I hope that this video helps you make better treatment decisions. I hope that you have a wonderful week, a wonderful 2025 ahead of you, and I will talk to you soon.